She's delusional. Your Honor, she's been off her medication for months. She's burning through the trust fund like it's monopoly money. And frankly, she's a danger to herself and to the legacy my late wife worked her whole life to build. My stepfather didn't even flinch as he said it. He dabbed at the corner of his eye with a crisp white handkerchief, turned slightly so the cousins he'd bussed in from Oakville could see his performance, and let out a small, wounded sigh. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just glanced down at the small silver watch on my wrist. 4 minutes. That's how much longer he had before everything he thought he owned stopped being his. Be honest with me. Has someone in your own family ever looked a judge? Or a cop? Or a pastor dead in the eye and lied about you to save their own skin? Drop a yes in the comments if you know exactly what I'm talking about. I want to see how many of us have walked through this particular kind of fire. My stepfather, Gordon, eased back into his chair at the council table, smoothing his tie like he'd just delivered a sermon. The Toronto probate courtroom was quiet enough that you could hear the old radiator ticking against the back wall. The gallery was packed. He'd made sure of that. My late mother's sisters were lined up in the second row, and behind them sat half the board of directors from the country club in Mississauga, where Gordon played golf 3 times a week on my mother's dime. They'd come expecting a show. They'd come expecting to watch me. Nora Whitfield, the 31-year-old disappointment. Crack wide open in public, but I didn't crack. I sat with my hands folded, wearing a blazer I'd bought on clearance at Winners, and I watched my stepfather try to bury me. Miss Whitfield, said Justice Lambert, peering over her reading glasses. She was a small woman with iron gray hair, the kind of judge who had seen every dirty probate fight the province of Ontario could produce. Your stepfather is making serious allegations about your mental fitness and your stewardship of the estate. I'd like to hear from you before we go any further. Gordon leaned forward in his chair like a golden retriever hearing the treat jar open. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to sob. He wanted a meltdown on the public record. Because a meltdown would save him. A meltdown would mean his whole pantomime was true. Chaos was his native language. It's how he'd run my mother's household for 8 years before she died. And it's how he planned to run what was left of her legacy now. So I gave him nothing. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I did not look at the gallery. I did not look at my aunts. I didn't even look at the judge yet. I looked directly at Gordon. And I kept my face as flat and empty as a frozen lake in February. In therapy, they call this the gray rock method. You go still. You go boring. You give a narcissist absolutely nothing to feed on. Because their power comes from your reaction. Strip the reaction away. And they're just a middle-aged man in a courtroom, sweating through a dress shirt. What Gordon didn't know was that I wasn't quiet because I was broken. I was quiet because I was the one holding the match. Miss Whitfield. Justice Lambert prompted again. I'm listening. Your Honor, I said, my voice low and even. I just didn't want to interrupt my stepfather. He was on a roll. One of my aunts actually gasped. Gordon's jaw tightened. For 1/2 second, his mask slipped, and I saw what was really underneath. Not grief. Not concern. Panic. He leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer. The lawyer, Bradley Finch, did not whisper back. Bradley Finch was tapping his pen against his legal pad in a quick, nervous rhythm I had been watching for almost a year. I first noticed that little tick back in January, when I'd gone to Bradley's office in downtown Toronto under a fake name, pretending to be a prospective client, just to get a look at the man who was helping my stepfather destroy me. Bradley Finch tapped his pen when he was scared, and right now, he was terrified. Bradley knew what was in the briefcase sitting by his feet. Bradley knew what documents had been doctored to drag me into this hearing. And Bradley, unlike Gordon, understood that paper, in the hands of the right person, is a weapon with a very long memory. I looked back at Gordon. He was arrogant, expensive, and very, Very confident. He was, in his own mind, only minutes away from getting himself appointed my guardian under the Substitute Decisions Act, which would hand him full control over the remaining $3 million of my mother's estate. The estate he had been quietly hollowing out for 2 years already. Like a termite in a beam, he thought my silence was surrender. He had no idea it was the soft click of a door locking behind him. Please continue. Your Honor, I said, sitting back down. I'd like to hear the rest. Gordon sneered. He actually sneered. Right there in open court, in front of a superior court justice, and started listing my failures like he was reading a grocery list. I lived in a 1-bedroom walk-up in Parkdale. Over a laundromat. My Honda Civic had 230,000 kilometers on it and a crack running across the windshield. I worked a quiet administrative job at a firm up on Bay Street. A job he always described as entry-level data entry. If you can believe it. At Hare A, I shopped at Value Village. I clipped Loblaw's flyers. I rode the TTC everywhere. Even in January. Like a broke undergrad. Your Honor, Gordon said, spreading his hands in a gesture of fatherly despair. My stepdaughter is 31 years old. She was handed the keys to a $3 million legacy by her mother. God rest her soul. And she lives like she's on welfare. Something is obviously, tragically wrong. I let him talk. Inside my head, I was already on a different train of thought. I was remembering a Sunday in the spring of 2024. Gordon had shown up uninvited to my apartment. Standing in the doorway in a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my rent. He'd looked around my little walk-up. At the second-hand bookshelf. At the kettle I'd bought at Canadian Tire. At my one good winter coat hanging on a hook. And he'd made a face like someone had left the milk out. This is humiliating. Nora, he'd said. Do you know what it looks like? People ask about you at the club. I tell them you're finding your path. We both know you're just failing. Then he'd driven away in a brand new Range Rover that, I would later learn, had been leased against my personal credit using information from my mother's old tax files, which he'd kept in the safe in his den after the funeral. Gordon did not know that the walk-up in Parkdale was a choice. Gordon did not know that every time he mocked my Civic, I was quietly moving another $40,000 into an incorporated holding company I'd registered in Alberta. Gordon did not know that the data entry job was actually a senior analyst position at a private equity firm, where I managed due diligence on cross-border acquisitions north of $60 million a pop. I'd negotiated my own offer. I'd negotiated my own NDA. I'd specifically asked to be listed on the internal directory under my mother's maiden name, Laurent, so that Gordon would never know where I worked. He thought I was drowning. In reality, I was building an ark. While he was buying bottles of Chateau Margaux at Sotheby's wine auctions in Yorkville, I was buying the mortgage note on his summer cottage in Muskoka through a numbered company. While he was humiliating me in front of his golf buddies, I was quietly acquiring the commercial lease on the medical building in Mississauga where he rented his consulting office. While he was telling my aunts I couldn't balance a checkbook, I was sitting with a very good estate lawyer on King Street, building a paper cathedral around him that he couldn't see, couldn't touch, and couldn't escape. He saw a stepdaughter who needed managing the pursuing the precedent. I saw a liability that needed to be wound down. Your Honor, Gordon said, slapping his palm on the table hard enough that one of my aunts actually jumped. She has no concept of responsibility. None. My late wife, may she rest in peace, would be heartbroken. It falls to me, as her husband, to step in and protect what she built. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see my mother's husband. I didn't even see a villain. I just saw a tired, over-leveraged man in a $6,000 suit he couldn't afford, who had run out of my mother's money and was here, in front of a judge, trying to strip mine her daughter to cover the hole. He wasn't a father. He was a cornered animal, And that is why I felt absolutely no guilt about what was about to happen. If I had only been his stepdaughter, I might have hesitated. I might have given him one more chance. But I wasn't his stepdaughter today. I was his creditor. And this wasn't a family matter. This was a foreclosure. Mr. Whitfield, are you finished? Justice Lambert asked, her pen scratching steadily against her notepad. Almost. Your Honor, Gordon said. A gleam came into his eye. He nodded at Bradley. We have proof. Concrete proof of Nora's incompetence. Financial proof. Bradley stood up. His chair scraped across the floor like a warning shot. He did not look at me. He walked stiffly to the bench and handed Justice Lambert a thick binder of bank statements. Wire transfer records. And account histories. Your Honor, Bradley said, and his voice cracked slightly on the first word. We're submitting evidence regarding the Laurent Family Trust. Specifically, the main disbursement account held at a Canadian chartered bank in downtown Toronto. Gordon couldn't even wait for his own lawyer. He stabbed a shaking finger in my direction. $680,000. Your Honor, he almost shouted. $680,000 has vanished from that trust account over the last 22 months. Wired out. 40 grand at a time. 50 grand. Sometimes 70. All to numbered companies she can't identify. All off the books. And she never noticed. She never filed a single fraud report with the bank. She never called the RCMP. Nothing. A murmur ran through the gallery. My Aunt Denise in the second row actually pressed a hand to her chest. To my family. $680,000 was generational money. It was cottages and university funds and retirements. To Gordon, it was the last wall holding back his bankruptcy. Please explain. Mr. Whitfield, said Justice Lambert. Her face was unreadable. My stepdaughter is so disconnected from reality, Gordon said, turning to play to the gallery, that she let someone drain nearly $750,000 out of her mother's legacy without blinking. If this court doesn't appoint me as her guardian today, Your Honor, she will be destitute inside a year. Her mother's name will be destitute. I watched him perform. It was, in a twisted way, impressive. He had framed his own theft as proof of my incompetence. He was gambling that no rational person would ever allow that kind of money to drip away unchallenged. Therefore, he reasoned, I must not be rational. Therefore, he must take over. We're requesting an emergency order? Your Honor, Bradley added, blotting his forehead with a napkin he'd pulled from his breast pocket. Immediate freezing of the remaining trust assets. And the appointment of Mr. Whitfield as Nora's guardian of property under the Act. Gordon looked at me then. It was not a look of concern. It was the look of a man collecting a debt. He was right about one thing. The money was gone. But he was dead wrong about why. Miss Whitfield, said Justice Lambert. And her voice had gone very quiet and very careful. These records do show a significant depletion of funds from the Laurent Family Trust. Can you account for these transfers? The room went absolutely still. Gordon leaned back and folded his arms. He was ready for me to stutter. He was ready for me to cry and say I didn't know. I didn't see. I wasn't sure. He was ready to win. I stood up again. I didn't look at my notes. I picked up a single navy blue file folder that I had placed on the counsel table at the start of the hearing, and that Gordon had eyed suspiciously and then dismissed as decoration. Your Honor, I said, and I heard my own voice come out steadier than it had any right to be. I don't have an explanation. I have a timeline. I walked up to the bench. I didn't rush. I moved like someone who already knew the ending of the story, because she'd been the one writing it for 2 years. My stepfather is correct, I said, turning slightly so I could address the gallery as well. The money is gone. $683,000. $412 has been transferred out of the Laurent Family Trust between April 2024, and last month, I watched every single cent leave. Gordon let out a short, incredulous laugh. She admits it. He said to the room. She watched it happen. She's catatonic. She's not fit. I wasn't catatonics. I said, and I let a little steel into my voice for the first time. I was patient. Justice Lambert opened the Navy folder. I watched her eyebrows lift. Just slightly. Miss Whitfield, she said carefully. What exactly am I looking at, Your Honor? You are looking at the complete IP log for every unauthorized wire transfer out of the trust account. I said, I didn't just track the money. I tracked the device. Every single transaction in that binder my stepfather submitted originated from the same desktop computer. The machine is a Dell workstation registered to the home network at 412 Briar Hollow Lane in Forest Hill. That is the house my late mother purchased in 2011. My stepfather lives there now. That computer is in his upstairs den. Gordon's face went a shade. I can only describe as hospital hallway green. The next section of the folder, I continued, contains the wire confirmations. You'll note that the funds were not sent to random numbered companies. They were sent, in escalating amounts, to an account held by a company called Cormorant Holdings, a numbered corporation registered in the British Virgin Islands in 2022. I turned my head and looked directly at Gordon. Cormorant Holdings, I said, is a company you incorporated using the Canadian passport number of Ms. Rebecca Sheridan, the woman you have been seeing in a condo on the harborfront for 3.5 years. The woman my mother did not know about. The woman, I suspect, most of the people in this gallery did not know about until this moment. The gallery did not gasp. The gallery detonated. My Aunt Denise made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. One of Gordon's golf buddies stood up halfway, then sat back down. Gordon's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. He finally found his voice, and it was a hoarse bark. That evidence is illegally obtained. Your Honor, she hacked my private computer. She's fabricated all of this. Mr. Whitfield. Justice Lambert said flatly, sit down and be quiet or I will have you removed. He sat down. Miss Whitfield. The judge continued, turning back to me. There was something different in her eyes now. Something that wasn't quite sympathy, but was very close to respect. If you knew the transfers were happening, if you could prove where they originated and where they went, why didn't you freeze the account? Why would you allow $683,000 to leave your mother's trust? This was the moment. The whole reason I'd waited 2 years. Because of jurisdiction. Your Honor, I said. And because of thresholds, I turned to face the full room. If I had stopped the transfers at $40,000, this would have been a civil matter. A family dispute. My stepfather would have hired a lawyer. Negotiated a quiet repayment. Maybe paid a fine. He would have been back in my life within a year. Trying again. I have watched him do exactly that to my mother's first cousin in Halifax. I have watched him do it to a former business partner in Calgary. Gordon Whitfield doesn't stop. He pauses. I kept my eyes on my stepfather, so I waited. I let the total cross $500,000. I let the transfers cross a provincial border. Because Cormorant Holdings routes through a correspondent account in Montreal. And I let them cross a national border. Because the final destination of those funds is in the British Virgin Islands. That pattern, Your Honor, is exactly what the Criminal Code of Canada defines as fraud over $5,000 under Section 380, combined with laundering the proceeds of crime under Section 462, sans-cheville. Justice Lambert's pen had stopped moving. I am also told by my counsel, I continued, that the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team in Toronto tends to take a serious interest in fraud files that cross the $300,000 mark and involve offshore laundering. I've been told that those files, once they mature, tend to attract sentences in the 5 to 10-year range. I looked back at Gordon. I didn't lose $683,000. Garden. I said. I spent it. I bought a prosecution. And frankly, I think it was a bargain. Gordon was cornered. But a cornered man is still a man with teeth. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief that was now visibly damp, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, like it had been sitting in a drawer for a while. She's lying. Your Honor, he said, and I could hear his voice trying to put its bones back together. She authorized every one of those transfers. She just doesn't remember. She's been under a lot of stress. He handed the paper to the court clerk, who passed it up to Justice Lambert. Gordon turned toward the gallery, and some of the swagger came creeping back into his shoulders. That, he said, is a power of attorney for property, signed by my stepdaughter and notarized in February of 2023, just weeks after her mother's funeral. It specifically names me as her attorney for property for the Laurent Family Trust. It gives me authority to make any and all transfers from that account, at my discretion, for the benefit of the family. She signed it voluntarily. Justice Lambert examined the document. Her frown deepened. The signature does appear authentic. She said slowly, "It is authentic," Gordon said. And now he almost smiled. She signed it. She just forgot. Which, Your Honor, is rather the point. Her memory is gone. She has constructed this entire fantasy about RCMP investigations and offshore companies because she cannot face the reality that she herself gave me permission. This is textbook dissociation. I felt a small shift in the gallery. I saw my Aunt Denise glance at my Aunt Marla and mouth something. Even Bradley Finch, who had been sinking slowly into his chair like a deflating pool toy, sat up a little straighter. If the power of attorney held, every single transfer was authorized. My entire fraud case evaporated. The honeypot would be just a hole in the ground. Miss Whitfield, said Justice Lambert. Is this your signature? I recognized the document instantly. February 2023. 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, Gordon had driven me up to his lawyer's office in North York, ostensibly to sign paperwork for my mother's final CRA filings. He had slid a stack of documents across the desk. He had tapped a finger on the signature lines. I had been 29 years old, exhausted, grieving, and I had signed. That signature was the spark that started this war. It looks like my signature. Your Honor, I said. There it is, Gordon said, almost triumphantly. She admits it. She signs things she can't remember signing. This is exactly what I've been saying. My stepdaughter needs a guardian. He thought he'd won. I let him have one breath of that feeling. One breath. Then I reached back into my bag, pulled out a second folder, and set it on the bench in front of Justice Lambert. That power of attorney, Your Honor, I said, gives my stepfather control over one account. It doesn't give him a place to live. It doesn't give him an office. And it doesn't give him the mortgage on the home my mother bought. Gordon's head snapped toward me. Your Honor. In the second folder, I continued, you will find the discharge and assignment documents for the mortgage on 412 Briar Hollow Lane. The mortgage on my mother's former home was sold by the original lender in August of last year to a numbered Ontario corporation. I am the sole director and shareholder of that corporation. I turned to Gordon, and I said it slowly enough that even the cousins in the back row could hear every word. I own your house. I own the commercial lease on your office in Mississauga. I own the mortgage on the cottage in Muskoka. You have not paid rent on the office in 4 months. I filed for eviction from the commercial property yesterday morning. The mortgage on Briar Hollow is in default. Gordon, you came to this courtroom to take guardianship of me. You're walking out as my tenant. The sound that came out of my stepfather wasn't quite a word. It was the sound a tire makes when the air first starts to escape. Your Honor, I said. I have prepared 2 documents. The first is a notice of withdrawal of this guardianship application, which my stepfather is free to sign right now. The second is a written admission that the transfers from the Laurent Family Trust were made without my knowledge or consent, and a voluntary undertaking to vacate 412 Briar Hollow Lane within 30 days. If he signs both, I will not personally pursue civil action against him. If he refuses, my counsel is prepared to file a statement of claim for fraud and breach of trust by 4 o'clock this afternoon. I slid both documents down the counsel table toward Gordon. And Your Honor, I added, I should mention that my counsel has already shared a full copy of the navy blue folder with the RCMP's Commercial Crimes Unit. So whether my stepfather signs or not is really just a question of how he spends the rest of today. It is not a question of how he spends the next several years. Bradley Finch did not speak. Bradley Finch was already, very quietly, starting to pack up his briefcase. Some lawyers can read a courtroom. Gordon signed. His hand shook so badly, his lawyer had to steady the pen for him. He signed the withdrawal. He signed the undertaking. He muttered something about ungrateful children, about my mother rolling in her grave, about how I would always owe him, how none of this would have happened if I had just been a better daughter. I didn't answer. Gray rock. All the way to the end. Justice Lambert tapped her pen once on the bench. Mr. Whitfield, she said, I will be accepting the withdrawal of the application. I will also be personally forwarding a copy of this morning's record, along with the financial materials Miss Whitfield's counsel has provided, to the Law Society of Ontario, because I have significant concerns about the manner in which your counsel obtained the medical and financial records submitted in your application. Mr. Finch, you may want to sit down. Bradley sat down very hard. Then the back doors of the courtroom opened. 2 RCMP officers in plain clothes walked in, accompanied by a woman in a gray suit who introduced herself to the court as a Crown prosecutor assigned to commercial crimes. They did not make a scene. They did not shout. They walked up to my stepfather and very quietly informed him that he was being arrested on charges of fraud over $5,000, laundering the proceeds of crime, and perjury before a superior court justice. They read him his rights under the charter. They put him in handcuffs in a way that was almost respectful, almost gentle, the way you might handle a piece of very old very fragile furniture. My aunts did not stand up for him. The cousins from Oakville suddenly had somewhere else to look. The golf buddies gathered their coats very quickly and filed out the side door. I watched him be led past me. He didn't look at me. I think that was the first honest thing he'd done in front of me in 8 years. Outside the courthouse, the December air hit me like a cold. Clean slap. The sky over University Avenue was that washed-out Toronto winter gray, the kind that used to make me feel small. Today, it just felt like weather. I stood on the steps for a moment, pulled my second-hand wool coat tight around me, and let myself breathe. My phone buzzed. A text from my realtor. The sale of the Forest Hill house to a developer I'd been negotiating with for 2 months had just gone firm. Closing in 35 days. Gordon had 30 to vacate. The timing was not an accident. I walked down to King Street, got on a streetcar going west, and rode it home in silence. I sat by the window. I watched the city go by. I thought about my mother, who had worked her whole life, who had built the Laurent name carefully and stubbornly, brick by brick, and who had married a man in her grief who tried to carry it all away in his pockets. I thought about how she used to tell me, when I was a kid in Scarborough, before any of this money existed, that the quietest girl in the room is usually the one who is actually listening. I got off at my stop. I climbed the stairs above the laundromat. I put the kettle on. I opened my laptop. I drafted an email to the head of my practice group at the firm, letting her know I'd be taking a long overdue 2 weeks off, starting immediately, and that I'd be unreachable. And then I did something I hadn't done in almost 2 years. I sat by the window with my cheap mug of tea, and I cried. Not hard, not loud. Just the kind of crying you do when you've been holding your breath for so long that your lungs forget how to let go. Here's the thing I want you to hear. If you're watching this and you recognize something in my story, the people who tell you that you're crazy are almost always the people who need you to be quiet. They don't want a daughter or a stepdaughter or a sister. They want an account. They want a signature. They want a ceiling to stand on. Peace isn't given to people like us. Peace is something you build. Slowly. In the dark. While everyone else is busy underestimating you. Sometimes the loudest thing you will ever do in your entire life is refuse to react. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to step out of the way and let the person who is trying to destroy you walk at full speed. Straight into the trap they built for themselves. My name is Nora Whitfield. My mother's name was Hélène Laurent. And the quietest girl in the room, it turns out, was the one writing everything down.